For a while it looked like she had won everything money could measure, and I had lost everything that used to make life feel stable. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it. While I was inside it, everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. By the time the divorce became official, I was too exhausted to pretend I was fighting on equal emotional footing. She had already rewritten the story publicly, positioned herself strategically, and negotiated like someone who understood that my grief would slow me down while her ambition would not. I entered the process wanting fairness. She entered it wanting advantage. That difference matters more than people think. Hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. Even before the papers were signed, I could see the tone of what was coming. She was cold in meetings, oddly confident in details she should not have known yet, and fully prepared to use every technical edge available. The woman who once cried when I had a bad day was now calculating assets, timelines, and appearances with a level of detachment that made me understand the divorce was not the beginning of her leaving. It was simply the formal stage of something she had emotionally completed long before. I kept minimizing it because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present, it reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. When the settlement landed, it felt like a second betrayal. She walked away with the house, most of the savings, and the public image of being the wronged one. I walked away with a smaller apartment, thinner accounts, and the humiliating task of rebuilding from a life I had helped finance but no longer belonged to. I would be lying if I said I handled that with wisdom at first. For a while, I handled it with bitterness, insomnia, and a private kind of rage I did not know where to put. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. But time has a way of separating what looked like victory from what was actually sustainable. In the months after, I learned things quietly. She had overextended herself. The spending that felt effortless while we were together looked very different when the household was no longer supported the same way. The man she had treated like an upgrade turned out to be unreliable where it counted. Appearances held for a while, but they required more maintenance than either of them understood. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. Meanwhile, my own life, though smaller, became cleaner. I tracked every dollar. I stopped bleeding energy into conflict. I rebuilt my routines with discipline because discipline was the only thing I trusted when emotion was still unstable. That is the boring truth people often miss. Karma does not always arrive as lightning. Sometimes it looks like consequences doing slow, patient work, while the person you thought had won begins to realize that taking everything is not the same as being able to keep it together. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable, softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually, there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. The first time she reached out after things started slipping for her, the tone was unrecognizable, less triumphant, more practical, then eventually more vulnerable. She asked questions dressed as small talk. She hinted at regret without wanting to admit it plainly. She wanted sympathy without accountability. By then I could hear the shape of her panic, and for the first time since the divorce, I no longer felt beneath her. I felt free of her narrative. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. I did not need revenge because reality was already doing the work better than anger ever could. Financial strain, emotional instability, and the collapse of the image she had fought so hard to preserve were all arriving without my assistance. Watching that taught me something I wish I had learned earlier. When someone is willing to strip a marriage down to property and optics, the same mentality usually follows them into whatever comes next. They do not suddenly become peaceful just because they got what they wanted in court. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes: the paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. My recovery was slower and far less glamorous, But it was real. I built savings again. I slept better. I stopped explaining myself to people who only liked the dramatic version of the story. And most importantly, I stopped measuring success by what she managed to take from me. I started measuring it by what I was finally building that she no longer had access to: quiet, dignity, routine, and self-respect. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. For a while, it looked like she had taken everything. But what she really took was the part of my life that had already become unstable under deception. What remained was smaller, yes, but it was honest. And honesty, once rebuilt into a daily life, becomes harder to break than anything money alone can buy. Karma did not hand me a speech. It handed me distance, perspective, and the chance to see that winning on paper is not the same as living well. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth will cost, or whether you will accept the cost and finally keep your own dignity intact. That choice is brutal. It is also where a real life starts again, and that is the part I wish more people understood. Betrayal is dramatic in the discovery, but its real meaning is revealed in what you do next. Do you go back to sleep emotionally because the truth is expensive? Or do you let that truth reorganize your life around something cleaner? That question changed everything for me. If you have lived through something similar, then you already know the answer is never simple. But it is still worth saying out loud, because